How's it going, Rogue Scholar, and welcome to another Flesh and Blood video. Today we have a Flesh and Blood discussion video going over some of my raw thoughts on, I don't know how to put this, like some of the negativity and misconceptions that I've seen recently about Flesh and Blood. And not, exactly recently. I would say, over the last 4 months or so. Every now and then I get comments or I see comments about Flesh and Blood being a bubble, Flesh and Blood being a scam, not worth it, gonna be dead in like a year, all this kind of stuff. So today I'm going to address all of those topics and give you my full raw thoughts. I really haven't planned this video out like I do most of my other videos. Today we're going in, like I said raw a couple times. We're going in raw and I'm just gonna give you my just honest opinions on all of this kind of stuff and kind of debunk some of it, and some of it might have a little bit of merit, but yeah, we're gonna talk about it today. I also feel like I'm maybe preaching to the choir just a little bit because I know a lot of the people who watch this channel are big Flesh and Blood fans, and they're not really the people who need to hear this, but in any case, I think it's still just good to talk about and good to, let the air out on, I guess. Before we get started though, I do want to give a couple quick shout outs. If you'd like to pick up Flesh and Blood singles and you are from the US, definitely check out FAB Foundry. They are local to me. The owner of the store is a very nice dude. I do have an affiliate link in the description down below. And if you're from Canada, check out Red Riot Games. Same kind of deal. Excellent pricing, customer service. They have some custom play mats. They have events, all this kind of stuff. Check that link out. Also in the description down below. But without further ado, let's start talking about today's topic. And the whole reason I wanted to talk about this today, this has been on my list, by the way, for quite some time. I have this list of just ideas for Flesh and Blood videos. And I wanted to talk about negativity in the community, or maybe just outside of the community, because I feel like once you're part of the community, there's like very little negativity here. There's some, I see some on Reddit, some people just posting random trash comments, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, the Flesh and Blood community is very good and very supporting. I know some members of the community who just give cards out for free just to get people to play the game, which is like, can you really say that about any other community, right? Is Magic the Gathering, or members of the Magic community, giving people free decks to play with? Not really. Or like Pokemon, like I can't imagine like Pokemon community just giving free decks to people to play with, because most of that community is collecting anyway. But the Flesh and Blood community for the most part is very, very supportive and positive. But every now and then you see comments like Flesh and Blood is a bubble, Flesh and Blood is a scam, which is like the most hilarious to me, by the way. The scam one is just, I don't even know. The scam one's ridiculous. Why buy these expensive cards when it's going to be dead in a year? All of that kind of stuff. So for the first one, let's talk about the bubble thing, right? So is Flesh and Blood a bubble? The game itself, I don't think so. I think the game itself is going to be around here to stay for quite some time. It's already proven to be successful in the first year plus of its lifespan, and traditionally speaking, it's pretty hard for a game to die after that, especially once you have prices this high. Barring some, enormous catastrophe. Who knows? There could be an enormous catastrophe that completely kills the game, but I do not think that will happen. I think the Flesh and Blood Legend Story Studios leadership has their heads, screwed on right, on good shoulders, all that kind of stuff. I think they're going to make good decisions for the game and the company, and I don't think it's just going to tank all at once. But that's for the game itself. For the secondary market, that is a whole other story that I am not exactly qualified to talk about, or at least qualified enough to feel comfortable talking about with any sort of conviction. But I will say, my full opinions on it, I guess. So take this all as opinion, not as fact, because I am not a finance guy. I am a collector, a hobby player. I love playing card games, basically. So that's where this is coming from. Just some random dude who talks about card games on the internet who really loves card games and is passionate about this hobby. So do I think it's in a bubble and it's going to burst? It's really hard to say. I don't know if it's exactly in a bubble like the rest of the trading card game ecosystem right now, because trading card games in general are exploding. Not just trading card games, cards in general are exploding because sports cards are doing really well too. And a lot of folks have talked about whether sports cards are in a bubble as well, and whether that bubble's going to burst and everyone's going to lose all their money. It's really hard to say. For Flesh and Blood in particular, I don't think it will burst. If it is in a bubble, I don't think it will burst, but I would not be surprised if we saw like price retraction on several things, especially like first edition cards that are worth a ton of money right now. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that go down a little bit and then maybe trail back up over time once things settle. It's really hard to tell right now. Some people are all, you know, like to the moon, diamond hands, all that kind of stuff, and they're just going all in on it. I'm not that confident, even though I'm one of, I don't want to say I'm one of Flesh and Blood's biggest fans, but I'm a huge fan of this card game. But I'm also realistic when it comes to expectations and that kind of stuff. And I've been part of a lot of different card games and card game communities that have failed over like the last 10 years. Warhammer Champions, this box right here, this is a Warhammer Champions Founders box. I really loved that game, and obviously it had failed. Dragoborn right here, I am a big fan of Dragoborn, also failed. However, those games I actually saw some, you know, some signs before they got canceled, before they failed, that I kind of felt that they weren't going in the good direction, and I do not see any of those signs with Flesh and Blood. So, for example, for Dragoborn, you saw like less content creators talking about Dragoborn, people complaining about the tournaments, the state of things, like only 8 people showing up to tournaments, which is not the case in Flesh and Blood. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Flesh and Blood tournaments, despite the pandemic, they are popping off online and otherwise. Flesh and Blood tournaments are popping off. So to debunk any of the no one plays this game stuff, that is absolutely not true. People play Flesh and Blood a lot. Is not just for collectors. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about some of the signs we saw. For Warhammer Champions, one of the big things that I saw initially was people complaining about like the power level of decks, and then the company immediately like nerfing cards and errata-ing like physical cards. You should not, by the way, errata physical cards. That is an awful idea. Even if they need to be fixed or whatever, errataing physical cards. So if you're playing against someone and they don't know that the card has been errated, it's such a bad feeling, man. It is such a bad feeling. You either need to restrict the card, ban the card, but do not errata the card. That is such a bad fix for a physical card game. For a digital card game, go for it. And Warhammer was both physical and digital, but when you have that meshed together, errataing a card is a terrible idea. And that was like a really early sign that I'm like, oh man, I do not know if this game's going in a good direction. And I was part of like their exemplar program, and I was a really big supporter of the game. I have a bunch of videos on this channel. One of my videos for the orc deck that I made, the WOG deck, was one of the best decks in the format. I crushed so many people with that deck, and that's one of the decks that people complained about. And I think it was a knee-jerk reaction. I don't think it actually needed to be fixed all that much. Maybe they could have fixed it with, you know, adding better cards to pump up all the other decks to raise them. Because I don't think it was that broken. It was good. Anyway, we're not gonna talk about that. We're not gonna talk about that here. What I'm getting at is that Flesh and Blood does not have those signs currently. The meta seems to be good. The meta seems to be shifting too. So for Blitz format for Flesh and Blood, we saw an IRA heavy meta with a lot of like IRA decks, both control decks and otherwise. And now in recent, the last couple weeks, we've seen a Viscerai, like control OTK style deck enter the meta and kind of shake things up. So the meta is still super young, very, very flexible, just minor changes. New cards haven't even came out in like months, and the meta is still changing, which means it's a very, very like young and like malleable environment, which is super good for Flesh and Blood, like super, super good. And that brings me to the next thing I want to address, which I kind of didn't mention at the start, but just something that I thought of as we were talking, is like people saying like no one plays Flesh and Blood. That is absurd. People play Flesh and Blood. There wouldn't be tournaments popping off if people didn't play Flesh and Blood. People are playing on Tabletop Simulator. People are playing through webcam. We just had like a big Chaos, or what is it called? The Creator Chaos Championship 5-player Ultimate Pit Fight webcam game we played, and I know a lot of other players are playing as well. There's those skirmish events going on right now where you actually get prizes and support for playing online in areas where you can actually play in person, like New Zealand. I've heard reports from there that their Flesh and Blood tournaments are out selling and out, you know, showing up. That's not the right term. More people are showing up to their Flesh and Blood events than their Magic events, is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, so in places where they can actually do this, it's popping off. And where places where you can't, there's a large and growing just tournament community online. And that is a very important thing to note, because a lot of people are like, oh, Flesh and Blood is just for collectors. And that's just because the biggest Flesh and Blood YouTuber out there, Rudy from Alpha Investments, only talks about finance. And so that's what everyone is getting, like this tunnel vision focus on finance, where they're not talking about like the actual gameplay. And littler guys like me and like DM Armada were like, yo, check out these decks. They're really fun decks. And some other people are actually uploading like gameplay content. I know DM Armada opens up or does gameplay content and that kind of stuff, but it's not just finance. There's a lot of people playing this game, so that thing is just completely debunked. Like, I know I just said it and you just have to take my word for it, but just go dig around. If you don't believe me, go dig around, check out all of the tournament reports. Last weekend alone, there were multiple skirmish events that were sold out and people were trying to get into them so they can actually compete in them. There was like a huge demand for this. And that brings me to the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, is that Flesh and Blood is a scam. Like, it's like invented by these people to be like a really successful game, but then to just screw over the people who buy into it. Is that what these people think? I have no idea what these people think, because Flesh and Blood is made by an indie studio that is just really passionate about games. Nobody makes a card game these days with the intent on it being incredibly successful. I've already talked about multiple card games that have failed. When you make a new card game these days, you have to go into it with some trepidation. You know, you have to go into it very carefully, because you know the marketplace is hostile. And I know that's why a lot of people, when we talk about the next part, they think the game's gonna fail. Why there's a lot of naysayers thinking the game's not gonna last too long, because most card games don't last that long. Yet some people still think that there's like some grandmaster scheme by like Legend Story Studios to hype up a game and then get the prices really high and then just bail on it completely, which is like is absolutely absurd, because that kind of plan would not work if that was your intention, because you cannot plan for a game to be this popular. It has to just grow organically, and it did grow organically because the game is really, really good. And I say organically because it did. It got picked up by content creators pretty early on. Personally, I've been playing Flesh and Blood since almost the beginning. My very first video for Flesh and Blood was back in March 2020, and I had played the game a little bit before that and gotten product a little bit before that. Keep in mind that Flesh and Blood came out in late 2019. And you know, a small gaming studio and developer like Legend Story Studios probably approached this like very, very cautiously. I know for a fact that many of the higher ups and owners of the company put their own personal money and lifelong savings into this game and into Legend Story Studios with the small hopes that it would take off. And then it had slowly taken off. You know, people like me who just love card games saw it and started picking it up. And then, you know, bigger content creators started picking it up. I know Rudy and Team Covenant have always had some sort of awareness of the game, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. Especially once places like Channel Fireball and TCG players started picking it up, and then people started to open their eyes and were like, oh wow, big people are picking it up, maybe I should actually try it out. So the whole notion of it being a scam is just absolutely absurd to me. Absolutely absurd. Just imagine being like a tiny little startup with the idea like, oh yeah, we're gonna hit it big and we're gonna get everyone super hyped about our game, and then we're gonna take everything away and we're gonna run away with the money. Like, who the hell does that? No one does that. What an absurd thing to think. If you were that popular, wouldn't you just ride the train up? Like, if you were being successful, wouldn't you just want to continue to be successful? Yeah, I don't understand that at all. It's absurd. And then the other thing I want to talk about is how people say that Flesh and Blood is going to fail in like a year or two. Maybe. I mean, it's really hard to tell. You can't, unless you're like some sort of Oracle of Delphi, soothsayer kind of thing. You can't really predict the future or anything like that. But we do know that card games are very hot in 2021, and Flesh and Blood is doing very well. It's just kind of going up. And even if that supposed bubble bursts, I don't think Flesh and Blood is going anywhere. There's already an established fan base for this game that really love the game and it's really passionate about it because, hey, it's a really good game. And even if there was a massive catastrophe, people would still play it, because that's what happened with Force of Will. Force of Will has had multiple massive catastrophes, and guess what? That game still exists. Booster boxes are still printed, new sets coming out, and there's still a small but very passionate community for that game. So even if something massive happens to Flesh and Blood, which I really don't think will, but even if one does, the game will not just flat out die. I mean, probably the worst thing that could happen with Flesh and Blood is that they sell out and sell it to like Hasbro or something. I think that would be the worst thing. And that's one of my big fears. I don't think they would do that. So to all the people who think that Flesh and Blood is gonna die in like the next year or so, you know what? It might. You know, there's always a chance for something like that to happen. Nothing is certain in this world, but I think it is very unlikely given the state of the fan base, given how much it's growing. Even like I said, if there's a great catastrophe, maybe things go down, maybe things cool off or even drop a bit, but I don't think it's just going to be gone in like a year or two. That's actually absurd. They would need something extraordinarily catastrophic. I was going to say catastrophic for it just to be gone in a couple years or two. And even people play and collect dead card games. I still like Dragoborn, and there's a bunch of other like dead card games like the Middle Earth CCG, box back here, the Middle Earth CCG that people still buy like today. But I think it's here to stay, both as a fan of Flesh and Blood, but also as a lifelong card game player. You know, I've seen these trends. I've been part of these communities that have fallen apart. I've already talked about this before. I don't see any of those red flags right now. So I think Flesh and Blood is going to be here and be strong for like the next at least year or two. Do not take any of this stuff as financial advice, by the way. This is not financial advice. This is just my personal thoughts and feelings about, you know, how things are going right now. So I want to cap this video off with some positivity. I would say if you are very hesitant about Flesh and Blood for whatever reason, you should just try it. Just give it a shot. There's a bunch of websites out there selling starter decks for like $15. Check out the Flesh and Blood Facebook fan page. People are giving away decks for free just so they can get people to start playing this awesome game. Once Monarch comes out on April 30th, buy one of the Blitz decks. They're like 12 bucks, 12 or 13 bucks. Buy one of the Blitz starter decks and then just learn to play, or even just, you know, play it on Tabletop Simulator with someone. Just try it for yourself and give it a shot to see if you really like it or not. Because if someone comes up to me and they're like, oh, I don't like Flesh and Blood because I think it's only for collectors, I'm just like, that's absurd. But if someone comes up to me and says, I don't like Flesh and Blood because I played it and I don't like the mechanics, that is 100% fair. That is 1,000,000% fair. If you don't like the game because of, you know, the mechanics, if you don't like the gory art or just the art style in general, maybe you're into more like anime style artwork like WeCross or something like that, that is completely valid, you know, 100%. So once again, my takeaway from this is to just try it out. You know, if the art style is not for you, that's cool. It's not for you. If the gameplay is not for you, you know what? That's also cool. It's not for you. Not every game has to be for everyone, but I would highly recommend just trying it out and giving it a shot. I think it's a really fun game to play with very unique mechanics. It gives me some like strong D&D vibes. It gives me some strong like fighting game vibes. It's very different from the popular games on the market right now. Very different from Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Like you gear up your hero right at the start with like weapons and armor, and you start out like 1 versus 1 kind of thing. It's just super cool and it's super interesting to me. You don't command massive armies of random little jabronis. You don't have like a bunch of little goblins or whatever like you would in Magic. But that's not the point of the game. It's a different kind of vibe here. You are the hero and you are fighting someone else. You're not like commanding a little, you know, Mons Goblin Raiders or Merfolk of the Pearl Trident. This is like an old school Magic references, but I think you kind of get the gist of it here. It's a much different vibe than the other games. But I think we've talked long enough. This video I can see pre-edited is like 24 minutes. It's probably going to edit down to maybe 20 minutes or something like that. But it's already longer than I thought. I thought this was going to be like 10 minutes long. So yeah, that is today's video. I hope you liked today's video. Like I said, I might have just been preaching to the choir here because I know a lot of folks here just already like Flesh and Blood. And like I said, if you're not into the art and if you're not into like the gameplay, that's totally cool. But if you are, I highly recommend checking it out because it's really, really good. And just pick up a really cheap starter deck, man. You can get into this game for really cheap. Don't look at the prices of like the $20,000 Fabled cards or whatever. You don't need that crap to play. Just get a $15 starter deck and play with your friend. So that is my suggestion. to you. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Big shout out to all of the positive members of the Flesh and Blood community. And I want to give a small shout out at the end. They probably won't even see this, but small shout out at the end of this video to Kitchen Table TCG and DM Armada, some, I guess you could say co-workers of mine, Flesh and Blood, brothers in arms, content creators, I don't know where to put it, but they're always really positive and really supporting on their channels, and I would highly recommend checking them out if you haven't already. They don't even know that I'm that I'm saying this. I'm just kind of throwing this in at the end. Starting to think about positivity here, and I think both of those channels are great for this game. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more card game content. Have a good one. I'll see you next time.